and I'll just bring it up.
I think we should start because Special Rapporteur Surya Deva has to go. So we'll try to, I mean, people will come. We have about 25 people online. And this is also lunchtime. We forgot to tell people there is lunch as well. But thank you all for joining, those who have come and on those who have joined us online from around the world. It's my pleasure to be here with this great panel that we are with today. Before I go into introductions of the panel, I'd like to just quickly mention that my name is Beena Pallical and I'm with the Asia Dalit Rights Forum, representing the Dalit community within the larger global forum of communities discriminated on work and dissent. I know that this is a term that we're still grappling with because, first of all, it's a very long term and you know, but the interesting thing about this term is that it encompasses different discriminated groups based on their social identity or social location. So that includes Roma, we have representation from Roma. That includes Haratin, we have representation from Haratin community. That includes Dalits, of course, which is one of the largest contingent globally, as well as in South Asia. Burakumin, you'll hear a little bit from Japan. And the Roma community from Europe, you'll also hear. So we encompass, which is known as the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent, looking at engaging and pushing for inclusion in the UN platforms, but specifically here on business and human rights, because we feel that at the lowest rungs of the supply chain, in any industry, whether it be the shipping industry, whether it be fishing, whether it be textiles, several of these industries are the lowest in the supply chain or in the shop floors. The communities that are from these are from the discriminated communities like Dalits. We can narrate several stories from India itself of how Dalits have faced violence, or these communities have faced violence. While companies and corporations adhere to strict rules and regulations in their own home country, when they operate out of the global south, many times these rules and regulations are flouted. And as a result of that, you know, there's a high case of violence, there's high case of all violating all the human rights principles, and thereby affecting both the dignity and the livelihood of people engaged in these industries. So, and we know that, you know, many times my conversations with companies, and I'm sure that Salil here will agree with me, that companies don't want to talk about uncomfortable subjects. You know, they want to be comfortable, they want to talk about profits, and most of the time it is profit over people. But our interest in this is that we want to ensure that while we're looking at the smart mix of measures, which is the overall theme of this year's BHR, how do we look at mandatory measures? I know that many countries have voluntary guidelines, but how do we mandate it? So how do we have a mixed measure of mandated legislation to voluntary guidelines to international mechanisms? And how can we use all this to further the rights and human rights of the communities coming from work and dissent and caste-based communities? And so we're here, but I can go on talking, but I'm not here to talk, but we're here to listen to 4 experts, both on the aspect of business and human rights, but also looking at what does that mean for communities like us who are coming from the ground and who are part of these communities on the ground and who are most affected communities. Before I go ahead, we have about 25 people joining us online. Please feel free to put your comments if you have on the chat box. We will be tweeting, we will be using social media. So if there's anybody here who does not wish to be on social media, please reach out to my colleagues. Johannes is here and Alima, Dinesh are here. So please reach out and let us know that we will ensure that we will secure those connections. Also, we please follow us on Cast Out Slavery. We'll put it out there to follow our updates, both at the Business and Human Rights Forum, but we will also be here in the Minority Forum to take these issues. So without much ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists for today. We have 4 excellent panelists. On my right is Dr. Nimalka Fernando, who's the co-chairperson of the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, and is part of, and this movement was initiated by the Burakumin community in Japan. You know that they face the same kind of oppression like Dalits in South Asia, which means that, you know, they're seen in the meat packing industry. They also face exclusions, but they had some excellent programs by the Japanese government and corporations to ensure that, you know, they are included. So that's something that Nimalka will highlight. On my extreme right is Salil Tripathi. He's a senior advisor of global issues from the Institute of Human Rights and Business and one of the leading voices on business and human rights. I think if you look at business and human rights and talk about business and you cannot talk about it without having Salil or hearing about Salil. So he's a key expert on this and has been involved in this, but also a big supporter of ensuring that Dalit rights and rights of discriminated communities are voices at the table to look at business and human rights. On my extreme left is Dr. Simona Torotcoi, who is the European Regional Coordinator for the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated in Work and Dissent, and who's also from the Roma community, and who will bring in or highlight the issues of the Roma community. And of course, the keynote speaker today is, we're very, very happy to have Professor Surya Deva. I know how busy he is, but he's taken out time from his busy schedule, who is a UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, but also in his report has cited instances of discrimination and how the communities discriminated on work and dissent must be included in the process of development, for which we're very thankful to him. So I will request first Simona, who is from the community, from the Roma community, who will shed some highlight the issues of the community, not just Roma, but the communities who are discriminated on work, dissent, and caste from that angle. So over to you, Simona.
Thank you very much, Beena. Welcome. My name is Simona Torotcoi. I represent the European Roma Grassroots Organizations Network in GFoD. We are a network of 30 plus grassroots Roma civil society organizations, especially with advocacy at the European Union level. So this is where I come from, but today I'm going to speak, as Beena said, about the larger CDWD issue, while acknowledging that there's a lack of data, either from the businesses side, from the government side, but also from the civil society side on the topic. We must acknowledge that this is a challenge, and through events like this one, we are trying to address some of the issues. Across the globe, about 270 million people are discriminated against based on work and dissent. Definitely, the ancestral occupations that our communities have, the inherited status many times, such as caste, are posing significant challenges and are the key cause of structural discrimination. This is rooted in old prejudices and they impact every aspect of our lives: education, housing, employment, of course, very critically the employment part, and access to social services and public services in general. Our marginalization in political, social, and economic development is exacerbated further in the context of business activity, intersecting with discrimination, leaving us powerless, but also vulnerable to bonded labor, modern slavery, child labor, and all sorts of hazardous work. While the path to economic prosperity and human rights is clear for many, it might not be so for all, especially for our group. In Africa, the DWD communities discriminated work and descent, come from descendants of intergenerational slaves. And we know that slavery is embedded in this social stratification and it's inherited. Yet, nearly 83% of the employment in Africa and 85% in the sub-Saharan Africa is being informal, cheap labor, resulting in exploitative labor practices. All the African DWD communities face a similar issue of lack of access to decent jobs, and they are forced into cheap labor, many times exploitative jobs. In Europe, when it comes to the Roma community, employment is associated with public scheme works. We have many examples, including Hungary, but not only. Daily laborers, manufacturing workers, informal waste collectors. We see Roma all across the streets in Central Eastern Europe, but not only. But we also have small business owners, workers in the beauty industry, and also some other types of jobs. Yet every third Roma looking for a job is facing discrimination or looking for employment, just because of the social identity we have. Due to the hidden nature, especially within the complex ecosystem of global supply chains, many businesses, particularly those with a global footprint, may not be able to be aware of the extent to which discrimination based on work and descent influences their supply chains. The labor of CDWD is exploited for free or negligible amounts without any social security or benefits in return. Among them, CDWD women and children are the most vulnerable groups. This is especially crucial to highlight since informal work is a growing part of the supply chains and poses challenges to job security, legal and social protection, as I mentioned, but also poor working conditions. And yesterday in the snapshot series, we have heard from Beena and colleagues about the situation of Dalits in South Asia, how they're present in factories such as the garment manufacturing, where the global supply chains are on the rise, especially the fast fashion. And this has resulted in serious violations of workers' rights, particularly Dalit women. Another critical issue representing the Quilombola community in Brazil, it's somehow linked to land rights and climate change as well. And this is mainly because of the mega expansion projects that are happening in the country, such as mining, logging, and agribusiness. Over the past several years, more than 650 mega projects have been developed on the land of Quilombola people or near their lands under the guise of economic development. These projects often result in mass deforestation, pollution, and the displacement of entire communities. Quilombola communities are forced to leave their ancestral lands, disrupting not only their economic activity, but also their social and cultural ties to the land. But today, as I said, I'm going to focus a bit more in depth on the situation of Roma, and I'm going to look a bit at the impact of smart mixes on the lived experiences of those affected by business activity. So when we know that when business intersects with deep-rooted exclusion, the effect can be devastating. Many Roma, as I said, are confined into the informal economy, exploitative working conditions, and of course, Roma women are quite vulnerable to the situation. And many times it's Roma women that are overrepresented in these types of precarious work. Many of Roma, as I said, are excluded from formal employment, and this poses a clear barrier to economic empowerment of the communities. Despite the challenges that we have, Roma is a young population in Europe, the fastest growing demographic group in Europe, yet it has a paradox. While the Roma population continues to grow, we also see that they remain excluded from the labor market, but we also see that there's a lack of workforce across Europe. More specifically, the unemployment rate among Roma is quite high. And we see that many times Roma are engaged in work that is unregulated, unprotected, and often insecure. I think that COVID has shown this quite clearly. The situation, while a challenge, it also presents some opportunities both for businesses and governments. As much we see across the European Union, but also in the Western Balkans, where the Roma population it's much more concentrated. There's a deficit of qualified workers. Many of the majority people from these countries are migrating towards Western Europe. So the situation is quite acute in the region. And the OECD data has shown that 1/5 of the population of the Western Balkans has moved abroad, seeking better economic employment opportunities in the European Union. And this led to a significant gap in the labor market. Yet at the same time, Roma and other groups marginalized, including migrant workers from Eastern Europe, also other regions, have remained excluded from the formal workplace. To conclude, businesses must play their part in addressing discrimination, both within their operations, but also within their hiring practices. We know this is a challenge. This means committing to inclusive recruitment, fostering equitable workplaces, but also engaging directly with the communities. Civil society organizations have to play their part as well, including CDWD-led initiatives. These are essentials in bridging the gap between communities, governments, and businesses. Their role in advocacy, monitoring, and amplifying the voices of CDWD people needs to ensure our realities, and also to ensure that there's a presence of CWD both in practice and in policy making. And we have so many solutions that can be done. We have both at the European Union level, but also across the world. We have several strong frameworks that have specific provisions related to discrimination. But as we all, most of us advocate here, we really need to recognize the specific form of discrimination we are experiencing and the impact this has on, as I said, 270 million people. So thank you, and I look forward for questions or any comments that you might have.
Thank you, Simona. So for bringing out the community perspective of the communities discriminated and work in dissent. We also know that there's a new supply chain law that has just been passed in EU, and we're hoping that companies adhere to that, and there's a little bit more consciousness and sensitivity to the issues of the communities. I'd now like to go to Dr. Nimalka Fernando to bring in more in terms of the issues of Burakum in IMADR.
Thank you very much, and I think the privilege to be here in order to discuss with you some of the positives and some of the more challenging issues that I see related to the communities discriminated due to work and dissent within the realm of business. I think what we need to, or what we have been grappling for a long time as people of South Asia or people of Asia is, while business have thrived, while you allow money to sort of remit within one button now, right? And how you get that profit in a system of generating money, and economies and development, the human aspect has received a very minimum attention. When I say human aspect, the exploitative labor, on whose, if you take Sri Lanka, on whose labor that we earned so many millions of rupees for our development. If you take other countries, For Sri Lanka, it has been the plantation workers. And plantation workers are the workers who were bonded slave-like communities who were brought across from India to Sri Lanka, which made the colonial empire thrive. Up to date, we are still talking about smart mix measures for these people. Where do we have the mandatory regulations, or how do we look at this community as human beings? You know, they have been enclaves, their housing. So here in this Business and Human Rights Forum, which I have joined after a long time, I'm asking the questions from Lipton, if I forgive me for naming and shaming them, the vast companies that have thrived on the tea industry, right? What have you put in place in relation to their housing, their health, and the education for the children? So what we see, the cycle of exploitation, and even generations have lived. We are celebrating 200 years of the arrival of the Malayalam community. They call themselves the people of the hills of Sri Lanka. The education and the children are left behind as to be in either as child laborers in the urban, coming into the urban sector, migrating, or as, you know, doing cleaning jobs, or in restaurants. I can count, I would say, maybe we need the data, only about 30 to 35 graduates have emerged from that community within the scope of 200 years of living in Sri Lanka, having a very prestigious university called the Peradeniya University in the hill country. So when you look at the initiatives that the business should have taken uh, in terms of respecting their rights as workers, still it remains a big challenge to Sri Lanka. So when you are talking about the smart mix of combining voluntary initiatives, in terms of the government legislature, we have introduced laws to accept them or give them nationality, because they did not have nationality, Sri Lankan nationality, since 2001. It was in 2001 as a result of the third committee resolution, where IMADR and organizations working with plantation communities focused on that, we managed to pass a law, thereby 350 people who were stateless were made stateless. Now they are Sri Lankan. So in terms of the mandatory regulations and the private-public partnership, there's still more to be done if you look at that community. And if you look at the migration processes that we experience in Sri Lanka, and if you really do an anthropological study, most of the migrant workers, especially women, come from caste-based communities. In Sri Lanka, the caste system, I should say, is one is more religious, like the Indian, and the other one is more feudal, the feudal-based caste system. So if you look at the Burakumin community in Japan, they were also facing the similar discrimination, but they had the Buraku Liberation League, which promoted the Levelers Association kind of a declaration called the Suheshi Declaration, which called for leveling of, you know, it's more socialist language, leveling of your social strata. So as a result of the Buraku Liberation League's immense contribution or immense leadership, they managed to get affirmative action. They were pushing for affirmative action. So today you see the gap between the discrimination and the state or the social strata getting sort of not very acute, but in terms of the online hate speech language, your name, I see a colleague from Japan here. In the process of recruitment, when you are applying your name, even in Sri Lanka, your name has a something behind it. So in the recruitment process, you get left behind and you have to face a lot of hate speech. So much so that affects your recruitment and employment opportunities. And especially if you are they're also living in certain segregated communities. If the important thing, which bothers me is within your own race, you are Sri Lankan, you are Indian, you are Japanese, but within your own race, you find this discrimination that impacts on your education and your employment opportunities in the future. But we are talking about global business, we are talking about profit, and you are exploiting a large number of people. She was mentioning 270 million people. But where is the protection for them? From plantation worker to migrant workers, if you look at the migration and the amount of money earned by the receiving country as well as hosting country pays so less for the migrant workers. So these are some of the issues that concerns me. And then when you are trying to look at solutions, how do you define when I look at the systems and what the systems are offering to us, they are saying, you should have tailored solutions for industries. You need to contextualize the affected communities. This is the language that I find in the business, in the business world when we are talking about a smart mix. So how can we grapple with this kind of real life situations with this kind of language? I have no answer, but I just wanted to say, when I look at smart mix, they're talking about combining voluntary initiatives, mandatory regulations, private-public partnership to promote equality and prevent discrimination. But how do you monitor that in a daily way? Do you have data? Have you established centralized, transparent, and easily accessible mechanisms for the workers to make complaints? How do you give more access for the discriminated communities with regard to complaint mechanisms within business? Is there a system? It's flowery language. And then we talk of equal employment opportunity. How many countries globally have signed the Convention on Migrants' Rights? Equal opportunities. We are talking about employment. So what the communities have struggled, if you take tsunami, if you take war, man-made or human-made, COVID, natural disasters, what happened to these communities, especially COVID, brought in the whole notion of getting their labor without making any pay during COVID period. The world suffered a lot. But how did we deal with I thought that even during tsunami, that there would be humanity. But during tsunami, we know what happened to the past discriminated, communities and the vulnerable communities. So it's all nice to have this smart mix, but it is also important for us to have that political commitment from the businesses and from the state. It has to be a tripartite partnership when we are developing smart mix measures to protect what we are talking about, protecting their lives, protecting their humanity, and protecting the labor rights as workers and as communities. So I'll stop my intervention now, but what I'm calling for is a collective approach based on a rights-based paradigm is required when we are talking about a smart mix for the business community. Thank you.
Thank you, Nimalka. I think one of the important takeaways from what she said is how do we monitor? I think that's really important for us to see because we have so many frameworks. Like I come from India and we have a lot of frameworks and legislations, but how is it that we're going to monitor? This is something that is really challenging. But I'd like to go to Salil now, as I already introduced one of the leading voices in business and human rights. Salil, over to you.
Thank you. It's a real honor and privilege to be on this panel, and I speak as an ally and outsider, aware of my own privileges growing up in India, and feeling appalled by the situation which has gone on for millennia. I'm going to divide my remarks in 2 or 3 ways. One is the role of private sector in this regard. 2 is to explain why the situation is not restricted only to India. And 3, what companies can do about it, and particularly in their home jurisdictions. So, the private sector in India does not have requirements for affirmative action. They do not have quotas. They do not have to have reservations. They have resisted it. They feel they are merit-oriented, which basically privileges the so-called dominant castes and the powerful castes, and it leads to some fairly remarkable statements, as it was made by one CEO once, that I don't know who is a Dalit and who is not a Dalit in my workforce. And then he said he did do a survey and said that 65% of my workers are Dalits, which may very well be true, but it's also entirely possible that they are at the bottom rung of the employment chain. They're certainly not at the upper echelons of manager. How many Dalit CEOs are there? Particularly of companies that are not Dalit promoted, Dalit finance or Dalit owned? Probably none. I'm not sure of the exact statistics, and it's very hard to tell. And it's possible that you can tell some backgrounds by their names. You can't tell all of them, and it's probably not the right way to go about either. And India hasn't done a survey or census of who is or who isn't on a caste basis for more than a decade now. So we are all talking about a problem that we know exists without being able to measure it. But Indians, when they travel abroad, and they're in almost every country in the world, they bring India with them. And when they bring India with them, it's not only how to cook wonderful curries, but also some of their prejudices. And that's the second part that I want to talk about. And we'll mainly look at the situation in the US, because that's where I live now. Most of the immigration in the US from South Asia and India particularly goes back to 1960s. And it follows a time when the US opened up the immigration door. And the people who made use of it were all these so-called dominant castes who were able to go to the Harvards and MITs and Yales and get very good degrees. And very often they came from the Indian institutes of technology, where again, they were incredibly smart people, but they were able to benefit from the social capital that they had enjoyed. And so you Indians find very proud of the fact that a company like Google or a company like Twitter, and now of course X is run by somebody else, but when it was the last CEO of Twitter, for example, or Microsoft, or many other companies, the CEOs are Indian origin. Very often they are engineers from these elite institutes, and very often they are from the dominant castes. And therefore there is a perception that we have all made it on merit, and we are all in America, and in America nobody can tell between a Brahmin and a Dalit. So where is the problem? Without recognizing or without being aware of the fact that as managers, they themselves might perpetuate the practice. There's a very famous case involving Cisco, the router company, where one particular employee who was a Dalit engineer, and he had a superior, a manager, who had been with him in India at the same Indian Institute of Technology, and he could tell that he was a student from the reserved quota and not from the main list, as it is called, and started eliminating him, excluding him from important projects, downgrading his job to other roles, and so on. And therefore, he filed a lawsuit, a civil discrimination lawsuit. The Californian Civil Rights Organization and the entity initially took up the case, then they withdrew from it, and now it has gone into mediation, and we will see how that plays out. But when that story came out, Equality Lab, which is one of the major organizations in the US which looks at the Dalit situation, started measuring it and did a survey and found that nearly 40 to 50% of Dalits who work in the tech sector in the United States say that they'll face some form of discrimination. It could be sexual harassment, denial of opportunities, denial of scholarship, denial of sabbatical leave, denial of promotion possibilities, and so on. And that has been a persistent pattern. And very often the managers are from the dominant caste, and that's why this tends to go on. And more than 250 technically qualified engineers have raised issues about it. Letters have been written about it. Cities are responding to it. Apple has taken it on board, and Apple has the protected characteristic. As a company, it has taken on Dalits as a protected characteristic. Fresno, a city in California, and Seattle in Washington state have also passed resolutions and made it an offense to discriminate on the grounds of caste. But in California, both the Senate and the House voted overwhelmingly to include Dalits as a protected category. But rich donors from the tech sector prevailed upon the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who's a Democrat, and he vetoed the bill. And it was surprising because the vote was 50-3 and 39-2. So it was not like a very narrow margin. It was a genuinely overwhelming margin was supporting adding Dalits. And there's an earlier case which doesn't deal with business, but it's worth bearing in mind on the textbook case in California, where now New Jersey is planning to have such a law, which would be a very positive development if that happens, because once more and more states start taking it up, other states will have to start recognizing that as an issue. In the UK, the problem is emerging more at a more glacial pace. UK does have an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to which complaints can be brought. 2 law firms have been targets of it because they are Indian-owned law firms where there has been discrimination. So while it may be true, we don't know yet because no one's done the data and analysis, that a pure Western company or a pure Japanese company, which cannot tell one Indian apart from or one South Asian apart from another, may not have discriminated practices among their employees. When it comes to companies where the managers are in a position to know, are acting in ways that are inimical to the whole rationale and purpose of a merit-based organization and discriminating on the grounds of caste. And companies which are going to India are also very keen to know, and I've heard this from a large European engineering company, which wanted to know that we are about to invest in India, what should we look for? Some of us said that Dalit is an issue. So they went and asked the local counterpart, they said, we don't know why we don't get the manager. Maybe they are not, we have a merit-oriented issue. So a lot more affirmative action related activities are necessary in this regard. So where can one look at for that? So one good starting point is from an international experience is the Sullivan principles, which were used in South Africa to eliminate race-based discrimination. What happened then was that there was a Philadelphia preacher called Leon Sullivan, and he was on the board of General Motors, and this is in the 70s. And he came up with what came to be known as Sullivan principles, that within the workplace, there will be no discrimination between whites and blacks. Within the workplace, we will make sure that we will have an affirmative action program to promote black employees, send them overseas to get better degrees, come back, appoint them as manager with whites working under them. And this was mainly as a kind of an experimental social engineering approach to it. And when Nelson Mandela was asked about it soon after South Africa had its first election, should companies have left? He said, we did want them to leave, but if they stayed, we wanted to operate the way Sullivan principle companies operated. So there are these Ambedkar principles that the International Dalit Solidarity Network and others have come up with about how companies can go in and operate in India. And Barclays Bank, the British bank, did attempt to implement them. I've not followed through about how effective they were. But that includes first of all, have a policy, identify the source and nature of the problem, have an affirmative action program, have a very serious zero tolerance policy of discriminatory practices, have a training program to skill up people who require the skilling, if it's necessary, make sure that work teams are integrated properly, have a zero tolerance on discriminatory grounds for hiring and promotions, and then also have a reporting system so that you at least know the progress you're making and make it transparent, make it public, hear from and consult with Dalit organizations, other human rights organizations to find out more about it. Have a board level responsibility that someone from the board of directors looks at it seriously. This is not in the Ambedkar principles, but something that we all know as part of the smart mix that's talked about is having a good grievance mechanism, which requires whistleblower protection, which requires anonymity, which requires fair and transparent processes. And there is excellent work on that done about how you can establish such grievance mechanism. Many organizations have prepared that. Have a Dalit discrimination check. If you end up acquiring land, make sure that when you acquire land which may be untitled, but it is owned by Dalit farmer, compensating them adequately and only with their consent. Philanthropy check. I mean, it's fine to have a philanthropic program, but make sure that the dominant caste don't come and corner all the benefits, depriving the Dalits of whatever benefit that is being provided by the company. Recruiting Dalit suppliers, looking for small in the supply chain to make sure that they are included as part of the process. And the other part is commercial lending. If you're a bank, make sure that they are not denied the red line process, which was a very big problem in the United States. That should not be happening here, so that people have access to finance. That's another part of it. And finally, something that is part of the Ambedkar principle, which makes a lot of sense and hugely important in contemporary India, where there is a big push to promote Hindi as a national language in every sphere, is that they are insisting that they need access to English. And they need access to English not only to defy the Hindi dominance, but also because it is a pathway to success. And therefore, a lot of Dalit leaders also are saying that we need that educational access. And one reason they want private sector reservation, and they're quite right in demanding it, is that the state sector is shrinking. So while the state sector is providing lots of jobs, and there is an entry point for Dalits there, if the private sector continues to expand at the cost of the state, it just shrinks the possibility of jobs. Now, this is a very difficult environment for companies these days, because there's a backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least in the United States. It is hurting right now the LGBT community most in the US, and to some extent the Black community. But I think this should not become an excuse, because ultimately any company that discriminates on the grounds of descent of a person and proportionately favors a particular group or disfavors another one, ultimately ends up being inefficient and not. Gary Becker, the great Nobel laureate from University of Chicago, studied the situation with the Blacks in the US and South Africa, and he has shown that. So there's scientific evidence to show that having a policy that promotes the affirmative action program is inevitably going to be more successful. So these are the kind of measures that companies ought to consider, regardless of a state if they're being required by the state or not. And once that happens, step by step, as it happened in the South African case, a class will emerge of managers, supervisors, and even chief executives who will be able to manage the economy. And then the economy will realize that it is better, that it is more inclusive than in the exclusive and reactionary manner in which it was run. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Salil. I think some pertinent points. Just to also highlight that we worked very closely with Twitter for over 5 years to try and get caste included in the policy, and finally did get caste included in the policy with a lot of difficulty. And just after that, 1 year after that, you know who it was bought by, and the entire human rights team was sacked within like a matter of 24 hours, I think, since they took over. And everything that we did, all the work that we did just went down the drain. So sometimes, we're almost regressing, not progressing. So I think that is something that we should look at. We also did a study on the fishing communities and how Dalit fishers or fisherwomen are discriminated in access to markets. So we talk a lot about access to markets, but they're not allowed to fish in the regions that the other fishing communities fish. But when they actually get their catch and then they go to the market, they're not allowed to sell because people would not buy. And we had several instances where they had narrated to us stories of discrimination in market access. So when we're talking about markets and companies, I think it's important to understand that unless we have a fair policy that allows communities to have equal access, it's going to be very difficult for the community. So now I'd like to request the Special Rapporteur, Professor Surya Deva, to give.
Thank you very much, Beena, and also to Paul for the kind invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here. So I will not try to repeat what distinguished panelists already mentioned, but try to make some connections with what has been mentioned. But let me start with the terminology that Beena you mentioned. And I think if I remember correctly, Paul and I met in July last year. There were just a couple of months after I started this new mandate. And I was about to finish my first report that time, and then I tried to include this terminology of communities discriminated on work and dissent. And there was a pushback from the editors in the UN. I don't know if I mentioned that or not, because this is a terminology which is not accepted in the UN, because UN editors have guidelines. Let me put it this way, right? So certain things you don't know, right? And I'm happy to share this because this is not confidential. And I pushed back against that, and I think somehow we got it beyond caste and Dalit, because caste reference and Dalit reference is easier. But introducing a terminology which is not part of the editing or editorial guidelines of the UN system is complicated. But I think we made a little bit progress on that, but I think definitely much more needs to be done. What I wish to do is I wish to talk about three challenges that I see from the perspective of my mandate, and highlight some suggestions, and hopefully that will be enough for today. So in terms of challenges, there are many, but I would mention three. First is non-discrimination, or the principle of equality, which is very core of everything, right? But I think the crucial point is intersectionality. Like anyone else, we should not assume, and I will, if you don't mind, I will use Dalits in India as a reference point, because that is the experience I have seen firsthand, right? So it will be important for me to highlight that element. So I think we should not treat that all Dalits are the same. We have Dalits who are civil servants in India, right? They're Dalits who have become High Court judges. They cannot be equated with the Dalits who are living in remote parts of India, right? So the educated Dalits and those Dalits who are not educated, disability dimension will come into picture, the language you speak, the sexuality that you have. So I think it is important to bear those characteristics in mind. So when we look at the issue of inequality or non-discrimination, I think the intersectional lens to this discussion about the communities is very, very crucial from my perspective. And I think we have made progress. Let me put it this way. When I was a child growing up in a village in UP, not very far from Delhi, we belong to a sect in Hindu religion, Arya Samaj. So Arya Samaj, some of you may know, is the reformist movement of Hindu religion. So in my family, there was no caste discrimination. Let us say 1970s, 80s, I'm talking about. I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about practice, not the law. Indian constitution and law is, of course, this is prohibited. So in my family, when people from lower caste, Dalits will come, we will request them to sit with us. And despite many requests, I will notice as a child this, despite my grandfather making that request repeatedly, many of them will not sit with us. They will sit on the floor. That is 1980s, right? And now, of course, my father is kind of social activist, so like we provide free newspapers and libraries. So now Dalits will come and sit and read newspapers in my home. No one needs to ask anything. So I'm also trying to highlight, based on my personal experiences, that we have made progress. I'm not suggesting, I'm not defending anything, but I've seen the progress in my village at least. You know, still discrimination is there. And I think it's important to recognize where we were, where we are going, and what more needs to happen. But I think the challenges are beyond discrimination. And I see here, I think that's where Amrit is saying development as freedom. Framing is quite powerful, quite relevant in the context of what we are discussing today here. And lot of challenges that we face in terms of access to education, health, everything is mentioned, employment is linked to the whole typology of development as freedom, right? Because these are the enabling conditions. And one cannot really realize the right to development if those enabling conditions are not there. The third challenge is more about the process, not the substance, and that is about the exclusion from participation. And I'm consciously using the word participation, not consultation, which is the main catchword in the business and human rights landscape, and I'm increasingly getting critical of that. Because consultation is not serving the purpose for which it was designed. So we need co-creation, we need participation, you need to share agency and power. And often that is not happening. It's not happening on the part of the government policy making, it's not happening on the part of policy making or decision making on the part of the private sector. And I think that is where the right to development is perhaps one of the most transformative human right, at least on paper, because it talks about active, free, and meaningful participation. It does not talk about consultation. It talks about active, free, and meaningful participation in all decision-making process related to development. And I don't think organizations are making full use of this. So I would suggest make better use of that. And in fact, my report in 2026, one of my reports in 2026 is going to focus on participation in development. So we are organizing consultation, and that's an open invitation. You can organize a consultation virtually or something where we can bring in that particular perspective from these communities, In terms of suggestions, I think raising awareness is important. I think the people in this room hardly need to be made aware, right? So how do we expand the tent and talk to people in the mainstream who should be knowing more about these communities? I think that is a very crucial thing. We need to inform more the policy makers, the decision makers, whether these are in the government, in the UN agencies, in the private sector, civil society organizations as well, right? That is a key role to do. Second suggestion I have is that how do we find creative entry points to influence decision making? Ultimately, it is about changing the decision makers' policies and ultimately how they are deciding those things, right? And you need to be creative, in my view. That is my experience. These are sensitive issues, sometimes politically sensitive also. So if you frame caste as a racism, some states you will not be able to engage at all. And that is where my suggestion is, you have to be creative. If you want to win over who you want on your side, pick up issues and framing that at least opens the door for conversation. Once you're inside the room, you're able to engage. Yesterday, India celebrated Constitution Day, and I was giving a talk about the transformative element of the Constitution of India. So how that framing can be used. Government of India, for instance, will not deny that Indian Constitution is transformative. They will not deny Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. So how could that narrative be used to integrate those particular issues? And again, I'm giving an example from India because I'm more comfortable and I know those experiences, but you need to find those entry points in your respective jurisdictions or of course at the regional level as well. The third, and this is going to be a bit provocative, is that you need to look beyond the Western and the global North lenses when you're dealing with these issues. For instance, I was quite intrigued by the title of this event, Smart Mix. Now, smart mix is a term which is gifted by Professor John Ruggie in the UNGP's Pillar 1. This is a global North phenomena. The situation that we're talking about on the ground in the global South is very, very different. So even if you have binding regulations, the question is not lack of regulation. The question is, how do you implement those regulations? Corruption and many other issues. And many of these regulations do not apply to the informal economy. Right? So even if you have mandatory human rights due diligence legislation that we had obsessed in Europe, in the global North, it does not apply to the significant chunk of the global South economy. Informal economy, micro businesses, family-run businesses, a lot of discrimination with people, Dalit people in family work situations, right? So how this smart mix is going to be relevant in those particular situations? So my suggestion to you is that I'm not saying either or, but be critical. Don't use a Western or global North lens. And when I'm saying global North, it's not a geographical phenomenon. It's a power dynamic phenomenon. Don't use those lenses uncritically. Look at the ground realities and frame the discussion on those parameters. Some of my panelists already highlighted the relevance of affirmative action, and I will just say it in a different framing, but the same message: beyond do no harm. And that is also the Western framing, I will argue, in the BHR. UN guiding principles, in Pillar 2 especially, they talk about, oh, businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. To me, that is a starting point. That is not the real thing. The real thing is, because if you merely ask businesses, don't discriminate against Dalits, that is very easy. But if you have Dalit child labor on the street dying out of hunger and poverty, should businesses have a role to play? That's my point. So we have to go beyond respecting human rights. Businesses have a positive responsibility, and I will give obligation to fulfill sustainable development goals. And I think that is where, again, I want to request you sincerely to go beyond this framing of the BHR discourse and the UNGP discourse. They're a good starting point, but do not feel constrained by them. Because the challenges that the world is facing, the challenges that the communities discrimination are facing, they cannot be resolved, in my view, by merely applying a negative lens. It's a negative lens with positive action. That you do due diligence, that is a positive step, but basically the responsibility is negative. Finally, and I'll stop with that, pick up issues that are topical. Let's say everyone is talking about climate change, loss and damage. Now the fund has been established. It is going to be hosted by the Philippines. Once that money is there and it will start getting distributed, how people from these communities will get discriminated? Will the money reach them impacted by the climate change? How new technologies are going to impact these people? So I would suggest, I mean, you're already doing good work, but these are just some ideas that frame issues which are topical and bring your lenses there. That will give you more traction. So pick up the frames, what is happening around you, and weave your issues as a thread. Come out of your silo and echo chamber. And of course, you can count on me as part of my mandate to provide whatever support I can do. I think I'd offered it that I can organize a development dialogue. We can do that. The only thing is that you need to start collaborating with me in advance. If you give me a short notice, I cannot manage anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So the smart mix is not smart after all.
Not that smart.
Not that smart, yeah. And I think it's important that how do we look at public policy or any policy, keeping the ground realities and the communities at the center. And this is something that we've been shouting for ages now. And, professors just reiterated that. I'd like to request that we have lunch after this. So please, the catch is you have to stay till the end. But before I open the floor, as I said that we've just completed a study on fishing communities, and we'd just like to release that. This has been completely conceptualized, drafted, and written by the community, the Dalit community in India, and supported by Rapporteur Foundation. So we just like to release that. There are a few copies we can share with some of you after. So if we can stand up.
Sure. Maybe she has difficulty, so we can do it. She can start. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I'd like to now open the floor. We have about 10 minutes before.
For me, I mean,
Before Professor leaves, so I'd like him to be there. Yes, Beena, please.
Beginning first, have a few reflections and also a few pointers. Salil pointed, I think we often make points in these presentations that wherever we go, we take the past with us, and wherever the past goes, discrimination follows. But I'd like to just say for the UK, which obviously has a huge diaspora population, there is a very small glimmer of hope for the glacial progress that has currently been undertaken, because caste is actually included in the Equality Act. It was introduced by the then Labour government in 2010. And the UK, despite its isolationist approach, is one of the few countries right now that has moved to the left rather than to the right. So we will be pushing the UK government to implement that clause as opposed to leave it to flounder where it is. So that's one of the things, and I'll be picking that up personally. You mentioned the Ambedkar principles. Thank you so much for that. I'd also like to mention the Ethical Trading Initiative guidance document to address caste in global supply chains, which we drafted with them, and it's fully published. And I think that is very much, as I said yesterday, it's a solutions-oriented guidance document. It's a toolkit. It's about identifying, assessing, and moving down to the remedy. And I think, you know, it's a very useful document to use in this context. I agree, Surya, about I'm smart or not smart. And it's interesting what you said about trying to get the wording into your report, because we found in the UK that the Hindu groups that objected so strongly to our work came up to me and said, if you hadn't used the word caste, we'd have let it go. So getting caste and Dalits in has been the hugest struggle for us. And if we'd actually used the descent-based terminology, that might have passed a little bit easier, but it was tricky in the UK to use descent-based discrimination because we might have been able to apply that to the kings and the queens and the lords and the lairds of Scotland as well. So which is why we didn't. But I think it's been really fascinating. Thank you all for fantastic presentations. I would like to be able to follow up on that stuff. And I know that you've taken some email IDs. If you're hoping, if you can share those, that would be really useful. I'd love to stay for lunch because I'm starving because I only ate a stick of cheese. But I do have to go. But thank you so much. Fantastic session. And Simona and Nimalka as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Beena. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Yes, Salil.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, I just wanted to comment, Surya, your point about the UN editors, which is actually amazing to me because this terminology comes from the UN.
Yes.
It came from the UN subcommission, which all of us fought for. So anyway, that's another issue about the lack of education. Yes, yes, I know. But the point I wanted to make was underlying all of these discussions, there's a very basic fundamental question of whether you look at violence against women or you look at the dehumanization of the groups we are speaking about, is the lack of education, right? I mean, at all levels of schooling and college, why is it that people continue to, to express racism, and no matter what changes are made, all these mix and all the guidelines and everything, but the racism continues, and it continues at all levels, as the special rapporteur is pointing out. And so shouldn't there be more of a focus on educating children to be human rights sensitive and, not to have violence against women or not to there's discrimination against Dalits and Roma and other people. And I don't find enough of a focus on that. So it's not only a question of developing curricula, but it's actually a question of, integrating all that into the educational systems. And why is that not done? Or if it is done in certain places, why is it not having an impact? Why are people still so insensitive? So I just wanted to raise that education issue. And perhaps the rapporteur on education can be involved, others can be involved, but we really need a fundamental change in what people are taught. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes.
I just want to thank you very much for the presentation and a little critique by Surya on this. While I agree on that, still, I think there is so much of invisibilization of this issue. Mostly you hear of course, India and Dalits, but you absolutely were very silent on what this kind of hierarchies are happening across other continents. And I must congratulate African people, African authorities, because just 2 weeks ago, Africa Commission on Human and People's Rights has passed a resolution, and that too within just a matter of 2 years of engaging with some of the commissioners and the community sharing it very boldly, that even today there is these types of hierarchies which is resulting in pre-colonial forms of slavery still being practiced. And the commission is seized of this matter and said that we are going to take a study in identifying the communities which are still being subjected to these forms, and will form a working group to see how these can be addressed. So they are very, very, very far from this whole aspect of business and human rights, but still in the social, cultural arena, I think they have made much, much more progress. And I think I agree with what Milun is saying. Somewhere there is a very sophisticated, resistance to any education to bring an equality dialogue, even in a country like India, because everybody is aware. But still, I think now you see the kind of discrimination that is existing in IITs and all these so-called creamy layer aspects. It's so pervasive, as to the extent that one is really wondering, is there any humanity that is left? Or because you're seeing not these people as human beings, as opposed to the African regional body like the African Commission, which is immediately recognized when the communities have said that we face this, we want an instrument for you to legitimize some of the concerns that we are bringing in. So I think it will be very interesting if we can take that to some of these bodies and then bring some kind of an education, which will then probably make sure that very elite kind of democracies will really make some attempts at an awareness which will stop this. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I completely agree with Paul in terms of the education or the position does not define that there is no discrimination or there is a creamy layer and all. Still, that persists that we have seen in the higher positions as well. But just wanted to also talk about what Surya was talking about. So initially, when we started around in 2016 working with the garment sector and British High Commission and few of the leading brands like Marks and Spencer was involved, and then we wanted to do a kind of understanding who are these workers and their social category, and we were not allowed to do that. I mean, they said, you know, there's no point in doing it. What do you want to do with it? But gradually, after 1 year, when we started our intervention and we kind of consistently engaged with them, and they said, no, I think these are migrant workers and we have all the right to understand where they're coming from so that we can look into the root causes of it and look into from that perspective. And we did, and fortunately, what we have found that these almost 70 to 80% of these people are from scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes. And we also did a study of the disabled workers within them. And there were 8% of the workers who were disabled employed in the garment sector in the first year of the supply chain. And then we now started designing the programs, which is more inclusive, having the people from different social categories and social identities. And then now our job is to look into where we want to go ahead in terms of the career progression, where they should be, you know, more skilled rather than unskilled and all. So I think it's also important to have a business case and tell this to the companies that, you know, there is a lot that you're already doing, but it needs to be strategically measured and strategically designed so that you can do it in a more affirmative action way. And I think that is probably going, and it's a stepwise process, and a lot of trust and confidence goes into building that kind of context. So that adding to what Surya is talking about, I think it's important to talk in the context, but try to bring the core focus work as a core of it rather than losing it out.
I think there are no specific question to me. I think, yeah, I think in the interest of time. Final words, I mean, keep a good ball. It's a fight. I mean, I have to say that
Defense for human rights for anyone, including these communities facing historical discrimination, is a marathon. It's not a sprint. So we need to keep fighting. We need to expand the tent, find creative ways. We are in a very difficult world. Let me put it very bluntly. There will be more and more challenges in coming years in terms of protection of human rights in diverse settings. So I think we have to be creative, we have to be resilient, and we need to work together. So how could, for instance, you work with CSOs and trade unions who are not looking at the caste as a lens or this discrimination as a lens, right? So how could they become your allies? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We'll just probably stay on for another 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, one word with Surya before.
Okay,
Just
okay, yeah.
let it come back. Yes.
So I would just like to say in terms of education, I think that's a really good point. I know that the Institute of Human Rights and Business, which Salil is part of, is doing a course on a very good course on BHR. And we have one session on caste. And these are to future business leaders, young leaders who are part of the corporations. And we do have one course on caste and how the impact of caste is in the region. Maybe we should expand it to globally how it plays out. But if other panelists would like to respond.
I would like to sort of say that one of the learnings I had from the Buraku struggle is how they focused on education. You know, a lot of affirmative action, the Buraku Liberation League had worked to get a lot of policies related to education. And I would say that has been a very important part in their struggle. And also combined with that, they promoted every municipality to discuss human rights. You know, so that it became an issue not only for the Burakus, but it becomes a more nationally and locally discussed issue. So that contribution from the Buraku Liberation League is fantastic for me, for Japan. And now they've come to the point where they're even together working with the other human rights groups and anti-discrimination law. I'm not sure whether that was passed in the Diet recently, but they were working towards an anti-discrimination law. So I saw that progression of community making their community experience of discrimination being felt even nationally. So I think for me, that's a very, very, very significant thing that you spoke about. They won every battle on the issue of education, schools, quotas, budgets, so that, you know, they got their generations through that. So today, if you ask whether there is Buraku discrimination, the younger people are sort of have to look back and feel that, you know, are we discriminated or in what areas? So no more in the issue of health or education, but in terms of more social experience of from where they come, their names, so on and so forth. It's been a very, very important issue, education.
Salil, before you come, there's a question. How do we, on the chat, how do we bring in caste and business on or DEI aspect in education and course curriculum? Maybe one thing where we can intervene and make an impact, not only through seminars or conferences, but proper academic course. This question is from Naveen on Zoom. Yeah, you could.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. And I'm glad you made a reference to the course that we run with Rapporteur Foundation at the University of Bergen, where we have a day, and it's possible to do it as a day because thanks to Zoom, we are not prisoners of people's travel calendars. We can all have them come. So the course is such that 1 weekend, 2 weekends are in person and 2 on Zoom. So discrimination becomes the day on Zoom. And what we do there is that it's about LGBT, race, caste, and women and gender. These are the 4 themes that we pick up. So I think we need more and more courses which teach these issues, to not only just have it as a siloed subject on discrimination and Dalits and do it and tick box it, but examine in the market. If professors have to start thinking about it, that if I'm teaching a course on marketing, what are the aspects in the way I present the course? What is the literature that I'm prescribing? What are the cases I'm using? Am I using enough Dalit academics as part of my curriculum, or even references that I'm doing? That's one way of looking at it. It could be similar with finance. If you're talking about financing for the poor, again, the intersectionality part that Surya was talking about should be brought in. And I think that requires that just, in NGOs, we talk about train the trainers. Here we need to train the academics about it. Because it's very easy to have a Center for Dalit Studies and have somebody teaching only about Dalits in that course, then it will self-select, and the people who will go there are those interested in the subject or affected by it. But what we want in it, at least in business education, which I know a little bit about, or even in legal education, is that it has to permeate and be part of almost every class. It doesn't mean that it has to dominate the issue, but it should never be disregarded. That's one thought I had. And one intervention I wanted to make after when Aparna spoke about it, business case is always a good argument to make, when we are talking about business and human rights. But my counterfactual question is, what if there were no business case? What if the case actually proved that if you do favor LGBT or disabled employees, your costs are actually going to rise, or the markets may not reward you? Does it mean you should not do it? And the answer is clearly no. And therefore, I say that yes, do the business case if it makes sense. Use arguments like Gary Becker's, when he talks about the fact that discrimination is bad for business because your consumer pool goes down, your employee pool goes down, your profit margin will inevitably suffer. He showed it with the case of US South and South Africa. And I think that's probably the way. But to make this, it's more of an aspiration to say that respecting human rights will mean better returns, because there's no such guarantee. That's all.
So any other questions? Yes, please.
Dinesh from the Workers Club Services. I hope Surya was around because Salil beautifully expressed the Indian speaker with the caste wherever we go, and then that's the Silicon Valley to all over. But also within the UN system. I'm here in Geneva last 15 years now. I have also seen in every UN staff coming from India happen to be from an upper caste, and within the minorities or within the, let's say, the independent experts or the special rapporteurs category also, there has been many from India. But again, within that, so has there been any measures of tracking the caste origin of the Indians working even within the UN system? Because if it is inherently built into the system, whether the person is here with the UN or a corporate, the inherent values and the biases that the person grows up with will carry throughout, irrespective of where the person is working. So I think this is important to identify, and if such a case is study is not done yet, at least if we can make an assessment and make it public, that also would be a better measurement, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, so I think thanks, Dinesh, nice to see you here. So I just give panelists one final, so I'll start from Simona. So I think
especially with relation to the Roma communities, but also to the ones that we have spoken about today, that there is a lot of strength in terms of mobilizing the specific workers in the informal industries or in certain industries. And I think some examples that we discussed before with Beena, like in India, there is trade union of Dalit women, that strength, and having all sort of legally binding agreements between this trade union and the business sector, especially in the garment industry, that shows strength, right? So how we can mobilize and educate our people to be aware of their rights and to act accordingly, and also not to become passive workers, but those that actually hold the power and can kind of shift around the discourse.
For me, I think one of the biggest challenges would be the present political context, global political context. Because if you look at the sea changes that we saw in the US, electoral victory within quotes, and the Israel-Palestine ongoing conflict, and whatever is happening in Asia, where all Asian leaders or some Asian leaders want to join the bandwagon of being, what should I say, the most developed country or the most giant economy. I can't remember the word. They're creating aspirations among our communities to be one. One India, one Sri Lanka, one US. Which brings in, sometimes might bring in challenges for our own identity advocacy, where you would say no to racism. This is now coming from the Sri Lankan politicians. We don't want racism. But what do you mean when you say you don't want racism, you don't want racist language, but we need our identities. But they can criminalize us. Saying our identity, promoting identity is also promoting racism. I don't know whether I'm making myself clear. So, I see this homogenizing again happening. Globalization happened, said, then we are in this global village, forget about everything. Money can come across, cryptocurrency to whatever. Now I think they're saying, come as one nation, we are all big nation. We are all together to share the profits of the world, which is not happening. So, which I think, which people gets bought over, oppressed people, why do we want to sort of talk about oppression? Let's be all one Sri Lanka, one America, one India. So I think in that kind of a political scenario, how would we keep our movements alive? How would we keep our advocacy innovative? And how do we challenge this big world business? Twitter becomes X, some Meta becomes something, so we are also very much relying on social media, and the hate speech in social media is not monitored by Metas and X. We see that every day. I open my mouth, I get attacked based on my minority in Sri Lanka. So these are some of the glaring things we see in business while they make money. So for me, I tend to feel that we need to be united. And I think the High Commissioner also today was very, very happy that this unity among the globally discriminated groups are coming together. And I think we need to keep that mind. For me, it's there's a big political challenge. I don't know, but I feel that, globally with the right wing and whatever emerging, but it's also not right wing. But it's something that is telling us, don't talk about these things. We are one country, one global.
Thank you.
Salil,
Final word.
Yeah, final word. A lot that needs to be said has been said already. So all I would say is that speaking about companies and their role in this, I don't begin with the assumption that business is a bad entity. I don't want to make that assumption because it's an entity. It's not intended to be a duty bearer for human rights, to use human rights jargon. It is an actor. Its actions have consequences. Some are positive, some are negative, and it's our role to make sure that the positive gets improved. And that does mean begin with do no harm. And Surya was quite right in saying that, it's not just about do no harm, we have to do more. But John Ruggie himself always said that this is the floor, not the ceiling. What he has created with the guiding principle. That's where we start from. Have a policy, do due diligence. And anyone who has been following the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in European Union will know that they require a lot of work now. Due diligence is hard work. It's not simple. People are treating it as a tick box exercise, but it won't be like that. And I think we have to keep more and more companies to do that. And it will have to have an impact in the global south, because the reporting they have to do is about their impact activities in the global south. And that's where the issues and the communities we are talking about have an impact. And related to that is the idea that, which I want to see a lot more about, because I also spoke about Dalits. I can speak a little bit about LGBT rights because I worked on that, a little bit about women, but there are vast areas that I don't know anything about. And I think sharing of experiences, so that the Dalits know what the Burakumin are going through, Burakumin know what the blacks have gone through. And so how do we learn from Sullivan? How do we build on each other's struggles to have a more common framework? I think that's one of the challenges, and that's one way to fight, whether it is the fascism of the right or the left, because it can come from either side. I'm not particularly saying that the alternative always has to be a radical left one. There has to be some kind of a middle path, and that's I know that many Dalits happen to be Buddhists, and middle path is exactly part of the Buddhist discourse, spiritual discourse. So I think we have to keep it in mind, and therefore in that spirit I say Jai Bhim.
Thank you, Salil. Just 1 minute as the chair of this panel. I'd really like to thank my co-panelists, Simona, Nimalka, Salil, and of course, Professor Surya Deva. I know it's a busy time, so thanks so much for taking time and joining me in this panel. I would like to say that this conversation continues. This is not the beginning, the end of it, but the beginning of several conversations like this. It is important to have those difficult dialogues. It is important. I don't see private sector in this room, so I'm hoping that next time we have the conversation with people who actually matter. So we do that, behind closed doors, but I hope that soon we will have that publicly. And the narrative has to change from shareholder to stakeholder. How do we convince companies and corporations to move from just looking after your shareholders to your stakeholders? And Simona just mentioned a Dalit women's trade union in the state of Tamil Nadu in India that had an agreement with the fashion brands called the Dindigul Agreement, which is an agreement that they had with the fashion brands on violence against women. And I think that we see as a very good model. And we hope that we'll have more of these agreements between companies and, and trade unions and people who are actually at the lowest of, supply chains that are working. And those are something that we'd like to see as we move ahead. We will take these conversations forward. So thanks so much. And just one small advertisement. If you're here for the Minority Forum, please join us tomorrow in room number 25 at 1 o'clock. We have the youth and some old youth from the communities discriminated on work and dissent speaking. So please join us. And I hope you're providing lunch, is it? Okay, so that's another incentive. Thank you, Jai Bhim. Salam.
Starting, I see, coming for